Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. Doctor Who is a weird show, and I don't just mean in the situations and the characters. Unlike a lot of other shows, it doesn't really have a set canon to it. Like Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry stated years ago that the only canonical Star Trek stuff is whatever is on TV, apart from the animated series, and the movies. Star Wars just revised its timeline to include the movies, television series, and new books being written in their new canon. Doctor Who doesn't really have this, so we have a mess of comics, audio dramas, books, short stories, spin-offs, that are all technically canon because no one has come out and said that they weren't. We got a bit of confirmation from the 8th Doctor's naming of his companions upon his regeneration that said, once and for all, that those companions' adventures are canon, but nothing has come out and said that everything else wasn't. And that's a good thing, because it means that fans have a wealth of equally canonical stories to experience. But it's also a bad thing because it creates a convoluted mess that no one has time to sift through. We've got like 3 different backstories for how Delgado's master became crispy, 2 versions of the 6th Doctor's regeneration, and 3 versions of Shada. I bring this up because since there's such a convoluted system of spin-off media, it means that there's a bunch of companions that have never been seen on screen that casual fans of the show might not know about, and I want to showcase one of them. Professor Bernice Summerfield, a future archaeologist. She's a current alcoholic, who the Doctor first encounters in his 7th incarnation. I first discovered her because she crossed over with David Warner's Unbound Doctor, and regardless of the fact that I knew nothing about Benny, I had to listen to that story because it featured my favorite alternate Doctor. And that inspired me to go back and dig deep into her backstory, which led me all the way back here, to Love and War by Paul Cornell, which introduces Professor Summerfield to the Doctor and Ace. And if Paul Cornell's name sounds familiar, it should, because he's one of the big names in the Wilderness Years and New Who, having written novels, audio dramas, and having been the writer behind the Scream of the Shulka web series, which was the canon New Who for like a day before Russell T Davies brought the show back. He also wrote Father's Day during Eccleston's run, and Human Nature, The Family of Blood during Tennant's, the latter of which was a remake of a novel starring the 7th Doctor and Benny. So we're not dealing with some rank amateur today. This guy almost brought back Doctor Who. But the question still stands. As awesome as Bernice Summerfield is, and if you've never listened to or read anything featuring her, she is awesome. Was her first outing good? Well, it is, though it's definitely a book written in the 90s and has a lot of the hallmarks of that. Anyway, let's check out Bernice Summerfield's first outing with the Doctor and see if she starts out as awesome as she became. This is Love and War. The cover is pretty good, all things considered. It's miles ahead of the Target novelizations, at least. What we've got is Professor Summerfield, though an inaccurate representation of her, seeing as her model now is her voice actress, Lisa Bowerman, who also played Kara in the final classic Doctor Who episode, Survival. Slightly morbid fact, Kara was also the last character to die in classic Doctor Who. She's aiming a gun at what I think is a Houthi creature, which looks like a giant hairy tentacle monster which has a giant hairy scrotum for a head. They definitely wouldn't have gotten away with that on TV. They're standing in a field with the TARDIS and what looks like either the Gateway Arch or a giant dash ring from Sonic the Hedgehog. On top, we've got the new Doctor Who adventures featuring the logo from the Sylvester McCoy era, which, full disclosure, I really like. And at the very bottom, the title and author, which I frankly think is a bad place for it. It's so out of the way that you could miss it. I think it would serve the cover better if the title was up there with the Doctor Who logo, but that's just me. Other than that, it's solid. Let's get to the book. Before we start, since I haven't talked about the Seventh Doctor in the show proper before, I'm gonna give a little backstory. The Seventh Doctor, played by Sylvester McCoy, was a chess master and manipulator who dressed in a question mark sweater vest and carried an umbrella with a question mark handle. Yeah, at this point, John Nathan Turner, the producer at the time, sort of went full-on crazy with the question marks, that had started out as a subtle addition to Tom Baker's lapels. He's a much darker Doctor, always having plans and schemes that play his companions against whatever bad guy he's up against. Speaking of companions, he traveled with two. For his first season, he traveled with the Sixth Doctor's last companion, Melanie Bush, and then, when she left, he met up with Ace McShane, a teenage girl from the 80s who wore a leather jacket and carried around Nitro-9 explosives, and she wasn't afraid to use them. She also has the honor of being the last companion of the classic era, the last serial survival ending on the Seventh Doctor and Ace walking off toward the TARDIS. There was a lot of stuff that was supposed to happen between them, set in motion by script editor Andrew Cartmel, but because of the series being cancelled, nothing really materialized from it, though some would happen in spin-off media. That's not entirely relevant to today's book, but I feel like someone would probably blast me in the comments if I didn't mention the Cartmel master plan. Anyway, that's basically all you need to know. Let's get to the story. The novel starts out, oddly enough, in Perivale, the hometown of Ace, but they're not there for fun. One of Ace's best friends from when she was growing up, Julian, has passed away, and she wanted to attend the funeral. She'd have liked to see him alive one more time, but wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. They leave the funeral, and the Doctor has a mission he wants to go out on, locating a specific book from a specific library from a far-future human colony world called Heaven. But don't worry, there aren't any Cybermen there. There are Daleks, though. It sits on the border between human space and the Draconian Empire, the Draconians being a race first encountered by the Third Doctor. The planet is named such because it's essentially a graveyard for all the human and Draconian soldiers from past wars against each other and the Daleks. The Doctor and Ace land near a settlement called Joycetown, and the Doctor goes to the library to locate the manuscript, while Ace gets involved with a group of nomads known as the Travelers, along with developing feelings for their leader, Jan. Not that one. Though, a Doctor Who Brady Bunch crossover could be interesting. The Doctor knows trouble is brewing on Heaven and says as much to a military leader while he looks around. Ace, meanwhile, discovers that Jan is already in a relationship with Roysha, one of his friends, who is in turn in a relationship with another one of the Travelers, Mary. It's a long story, I'll get to it in the character section. For right now, just know that Roysha is investigating a strange, seemingly living white fiber that they found earlier, and jarred for safekeeping, but accidentally shatters the jar and steps on the fiber to kill it. Meanwhile, Phaedrus, a disciple of the Vacuum Church, who worship the mighty Hoover and believe that David Orrick rose from a vacuum bag after 3 days, performs a ritual sacrifice on one of his fellow church members, who, after he's killed, is taken over by a fungus, presumably becoming a hairy scrotum monster like on the cover. Ace also meets Professor Bernice Summerfield, who is currently excavating a Heavenite building. Her and Ace get on like a house on fire because Ace is from the 80s and Benny's area of historical expertise is the 20th century. So Benny is excited to pick Ace's brain about real primary source information about the era. Phaedrus also confronts Roysha, telling her that terrible things are coming. Ace eventually goes back to the Travelers and is invited to one of their rituals in pewter space, their word for VR, and finds out the backstory for Roisha and why Jan is with her, before the ritual is interrupted by a strange spear showing up and attacking them in pewter space. And as is common in most fiction, if you die in pewter space, you die in real life. Their priest, Christopher, a genderless human because of military experimentation, sacrifices themselves to ensure that the rest of them emerge from pewter space unharmed. The Doctor finds his way to Professor Summerfield's dig, examines her dig site, and while the two of them are walking back to town, they're attacked by a fungus monster, whose arm is shot off by Benny. The monster runs off, but leaves its arm behind, which is infected with white filaments, not unlike the fiber that Roisha stepped on. Ace returns to the TARDIS that night, and the Doctor asks for her help in finding the book, attempting to dissuade her from her blooming relationship with Jan, while he goes off to investigate the Travelers. The Doctor enters pewter space to check on what had happened the night before, but Phaedrus and his people implanted a trap program to keep the Doctor stuck in his worst memories, like the painful memories of the Third Doctor's slow death by radiation poisoning. Ace returns with news on the book and finds the Doctor slowly dying, and she plugs herself in to save him. This causes her to get trapped in her memories of her childhood, but something is off, and the Doctor reveals that it's because it's someone else's memories. Someone else who knew her very well. They end up in a hospital where Julian, Ace's friend, is dying and she talks to him, finding out that he's been absorbed into the Houthi hive mind, the Houthi being the fungus people. The Doctor liberates Julian, and with his help they reconstruct Christopher, before Phaedrus shows up to send Julian back into the hive mind. Ace, out of revenge, turns the program back on Phaedrus, trapping him in his own bad memories as the Doctor and Ace escape. The Doctor, Ace, and the Travelers raid the library and find out that the last person to hold the manuscript was none other than Bernice Summerfield, and the Doctor finally gets his hands on the manuscript, which has handwritten notes from himself in it, presumably from his own future, which allows the book to be used as a Rosetta Stone for the Heavenite writing in the building, which is found to be an observatory. The military leader that the Doctor spoke to before returns, telling the Doctor that one of his men is infected by the Houthi and has taken over their orbital space station, leaving the planet entirely defenseless. And that's the main driving force of the book, the Doctor attempting to scheme his way into saving Heaven and its colonists from being overrun and destroyed by a Houthi invasion force. And like most of the time, not everybody lives. Not even just this once. Eventually, Phaedrus escapes the trap and goes to infect the entire Traveler camp with spores. They're mostly rescued by Christopher, who, thanks to Julian reconstructing their essence in pewter space, can apparently now control their body remotely from pewter space. Just go with it. Christopher absorbs the spores into their body, since the spores can't hurt them. Though Christopher, before going off again, warns Ace that if she stays with Jan, a sacrifice will have to be made. Unfortunately, that doesn't help all that much because the Houthi are weaponizing all the dead on Heaven, just like the Gelth, Daleks, and Cybermen would later do. The Doctor springs into action, trying to save the day, while Benny and Ace do the same. The Doctor is intent on getting the observatory dug up because it apparently has something that will help them win. The Doctor also tells everyone that the infected cannot be saved. If a spore gets you, you're as good as dead. Roisha, knowing that she was infected when she stepped on the spore, goes to destroy the vacuum church in a suicide bombing, after telling Jan that he has her blessing to be with Ace, while Jan, Mary, and Ace go up on a shuttle to launch it as a projectile at the Houthi ship, before ejecting. However, Jan and everyone except Mary and Ace are also infected, and Jan ejects everyone else. The Doctor, upon finding out that Ace went up with Jan and the others, immediately rushes to the Houthi spear in the TARDIS with Benny to strike up a deal, as he is also apparently infected. They want him to destroy the communications equipment to prevent help from arriving, in exchange for being able to leave with Ace. They also attempt to infect Benny, which the Doctor sneakily prevents but doesn't tell anyone. The Doctor returns to do what he promised and sends Benny off to find Ace's pod. Phaedrus goes back into pewter space, and Ace follows him in to retaliate for Jan's death. The Doctor destroys the communications equipment and then goes into pewter space to find Ace, and with Christopher's help uses Jan's pyrokinesis to ignite the Houthi spear, getting Jan to sacrifice himself, needs of the many style. The Doctor also reveals that this was part of a long game and that he knew Jan was infected and had planted the seeds of the idea to attack the spear. They won, but at a cost that Ace was not prepared for. They pick up the pieces, with Ace keeping her distance from the Doctor, and Ace finds that Phaedrus is still alive, and kills himself to allow the Houthi to live again. Roysha, having been captured after her failed suicide attempt, pushes Ace toward the last Houthi for her to be absorbed, but Mary, who had been presumed dead when her shuttle crashed into the church, turns out to be alive and shoots Roysha. Ace calls upon Julian once more and gets him to rebel against the hive mind and destroys it. The Doctor is ready to head out, but Ace refuses to go, choosing instead to help the travelers rebuild with Mary, even leaving her jacket in the TARDIS, and the Doctor is prepared to go it alone. Until Benny shows up, not quite happy with how he gambled with her life too, but ready to go on adventures with him as the novel ends. Yes, come along, Jamie. Oh, hello, I'm the Doctor, and we'll be right back. Look, I don't have a 7th Doctor costume, okay? And we're back with more of the show. This is the closest I've got. The established characters, the Doctor and Ace, are perfectly in character. The Doctor is scheming, and Ace is her usual, if a bit sad, badass self. Naturally, the Doctor does go a bit too far, but it is exactly as the Doctor was towards the end of his era. A master manipulator who knows far more than he lets on. I think it was great having Ace leave at the end, because it was like when Tegan left and when Victoria left. She can't handle the Doctor and his scheming anymore. And I get that. If my life and the life of people I loved and cared about were being moved around like chess pieces, even to serve the greater good, that's not fair to Ace. And her leaving shows a maturity in her that I think not even the show really got to give her. Though I admit I haven't seen all that much of the 7th Doctor, so I could just be conflating that with the 2 stories with Ace that I have seen. Benny is awesome. From her first moments to her finally becoming a companion, she is awesome through and through. She's not only a great archaeologist, but she's funny. She bounces perfectly off both of Ace and the Doctor, and she's all set to be part of the team. She's already got a vendetta against the Daleks. I think that all 3 of them work perfectly together, and Bernice Summerfield is a really good addition to the Doctor Who canon. Admittedly, I already liked her from the Big Finish stuff, but still. The Travelers, despite being mostly one-offs, are really good. They aren't just random people the Doctor and Ace meet up with. We get all this backstory for them, which makes them into fully fleshed out characters. For example, Christopher, we find out, lost their gender in an experiment they underwent in lieu of being drafted during the war. It gave them psychic powers, which is how he managed to save his essence in pewter space, I guess, but had drawbacks, mainly the fact that his sexual organs sort of melted off, according to Jan. Jan wasn't experimented on as much, so he just has pyrokinetic powers. Christopher and Roysha had a thing, and Jan promised Christopher that he would take care of Roysha romantically, since Christopher couldn't. Which is why he was so hesitant with Ace at first, because he's with Roysha out of the promise he made. Though I'm sure he really does love her, but she's also with Mary, so naturally he needs options too. Roysha, I feel, was really underdeveloped. The most we really get from her, at least what I retained from the book, was the thing with Jan, and then when she found out she was a goner, there wasn't a lot of substance with that. And I didn't really feel that bad when Jan died. Probably because the Doctor was alluding to that fact from the start. And knowing the Doctor, I knew that Jan probably wouldn't survive the story. I am happy that he got to go out in a literal blaze of glory, though. There's not really a better way to die than taking out a hive mind. I also feel like, aside from his backstory, we don't get enough of Christopher before his death to really feel bad about it. Sure, he comes back and manages to save the day in his own way, but the other characters feel the impact of his initial death, something that I didn't. Phaedrus is sort of a crap villain. All he's got going for him is being ominous as hell, but the Doctor's already got ominous covered, so he's not as impressive. Plus, we've got the Houthi as our main villain, and they're even scarier because they're a hive mind like the Borg, so Phaedrus is even less of a real threat until the end. And even then, he's still just a conduit for the Houthi. On the flip side, the Houthi are great villains, especially given their long history with Gallifrey. They had attempted to invade it, but were repelled and disappeared until the events of this book. And I like how they weaponized the dead on Heaven, because it shows foresight that, at the time, was really only being shown by the Doctor. They pose a very distinct threat, and at times I did feel like this might be one of those save the day by hitting the reset button stories because all is lost, as opposed to one where the day is barely saved. The book is full of action from start to finish, from the Doctor's machinations against the Houthi, the pewter space stuff, the invasion. There is never a dull moment in the book. Sure, the pewter space stuff is goofy as hell and super duper 90s, but it's still used in an interesting way. That bit where they meet with Julian in pewter space to reconstruct Christopher and turn the trap against Phaedrus is awesome. It's a unique way to handle a hive mind. Instead of putting a virus into it, they help the person break free of it to destroy it. Admittedly, the whole thing with Julian being in it is a bit contrived, like the Houthi just happened to have had also absorbed people from Earth in 1992 before their big invasion. But I'll let it slide because it's done so well that I don't mind it being a little too easy for them to have an in with the hive mind. There's a lot of fighting in this, and I feel like this is definitely a book that wouldn't have quite worked on the screen, at least with the effects that the show would have had in 1992. The Houthi are goofy as it is, based on the cover, and I feel like maybe it would have been an okay design, but I also feel like it might have looked like a discount Yeti. Like I said, the story did feel like it might be an all is lost story, so I was at the edge of my seat for a good chunk of it. Plus, it has all the hallmarks of a good Doctor Who story. We've got scheming, long games, the Doctor monologuing to himself and to his companions, and it also does a good job of introducing Benny and her backstory without making it feel like backstory. We find out about Benny as her and Ace are comparing notes. Nothing feels like it slows the plot down to explain stuff. The plot moves at a decent pace, and the exposition doesn't feel like exposition. But your mileage on that may vary, because I already knew her backstory from the audio dramas I had listened to that touched on them as well. The book is phenomenal. It's a great story in general of life and death and love and birth and peace and war on the planet Heaven. That didn't really scan right, but it is a great tale of life, death, love, and war. The characters are great, and this has facets that I don't think even the Sylvester McCoy era of the show had in its stories. I mean, I knew that it would be good. Human Nature is one of my favorite Tennant era episodes, so I knew that this guy had talent, but the book blew me away. Paul Cornell understands the Doctor and his world, and I don't know if he had any contact with the writing team about the Cartmel Master Plan, but this book fits right in with it, giving the Doctor a darker edge, going too far, and I love it. Obviously, I recommend it, wholeheartedly so. It's one of the best Doctor Who books that I've ever read, and I also want to recommend the original Human Nature book as well. I haven't finished reading it yet, but since I love the episode, I'm fairly certain I'm gonna like the book. I also want to toss in a recommendation for Scream of the Shalka, cause that's also a good show of his writing talent, and I think that it deserves more love. Oh, and the comic story he did, The Four Doctors, is good too. Though I warn you, the name is a bit of a misnomer. If you're hoping for the Ninth Doctor in that, you're gonna be disappointed. Yeah, I know those aren't really book recommendations, but it's unique to find a licensed author who has been so ingrained in the extensive canon of a franchise that I felt it necessary to showcase his other works that are just as phenomenal as this book. And that was Love and War. Was it good? Well, as the Doctor would say, oh yes, it is by far the perfect combination of story and characters and action that when put together gives out a phenomenal Doctor Who story. We need more stuff like this on the show. Maybe Cornell can return to give us a few stories during the Whittaker era? I can totally see why Bernie Summerfield is a character that has not only endured over 2 decades, but has survived through Virgin Publishing losing their Doctor Who license, and crossed over to audio dramas, and even returned to print recently in a BBC Books release where she meets up with the 12th Doctor and Clara. She is utterly brilliant, and I look forward to reading more of her adventures in the future. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of the Literary Lair, you can hit that subscribe button. And if you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can put those in the comments section below. Oh, and if you want to be notified of new uploads, you can hit that bell icon. And if you enjoyed this video, show it to your friends and share it around the internet. And maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. See you next time for our first Patreon-sponsored review. So it all started when Mike Sano started to fall ill due to a teleportation accident a few years ago. That's right. Are you getting his memories? It goes in and out, but I think I get the gist. This does explain a few things. What do you mean? During my own experiments, I was attempting to create a teleporter, but when I went to test it, it recorded a pattern failure, as if it tried to teleport me, but there was nothing to teleport. 'Cause we grabbed you. Exactly. Now I take it you have a plan to reverse this. I do not. But that's where you come in. If you have your intellect and Mike Sano's, between the two of you, you could probably help me figure it out. You mean you'll assist me? I am no one's assistant. Whatever works for you. Say, what do we call you? My given name, I presume, Thomas, or if you'd prefer, Dr. Steele. But you're not really Thomas Steele anymore. You're also Mike Sano. I suppose that you can just call me Professor, since that is both a title of dignity, and I feel like if I let you call me by my first name, you would start calling me Tommy, which I would dislike. Alright, Professor. Say, what are you a doctor of anyway? Mike Sano was sort of a doctor-professor of mad science. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I mainly worked in physics, atoms and such. Good to have you on board. You have full use of Mike Sano's lab, and I'll get IOTA started on getting you credentials to get around security. I'll brief you on that situation later. Right now, I'm sure that you probably want to rest with all that stuff bouncing around in your head. That would be preferable. I'm not sure how I feel about you yet, but the part of me that's Mike Sano seems to trust you implicitly. I hope he's a good judge of character. I hope so too.